I'm Lori Mole, and I acknowledge I'm joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people. I'm grateful and beyond, deep feelings for being such a long-time resident of the area to be able to learn and work with you on the shared territories of the Snonanas and Qualicum First Nations. As your local Work BC Employer Services Center, the Career Center supports those who are looking for employment as well as employers. So building and maintaining healthy, stable, safe, productive, and profitable workplaces builds sustainable employment and business success. The Career Center is pleased to offer these 3 workshops during BC Small Business Week, and we appreciate the promotional support of our 2 local chambers of commerce. Good things can happen when we work together. The format of the afternoon is fairly casual, and we're going to follow a similar process that we're all pretty much accustomed to with Zoom workshops. I invite you to put your questions in the chat area at any time, but we'll probably save those for at the Q&A at the end. My colleague Scott will be keeping an eye on the chat, and that way we'll make sure we don't miss any questions. You've probably noticed that the session is being recorded. I would encourage you to leave your cameras on, as it's much nicer to present to some faces rather than rows of black boxes. We ask that you keep your microphone on mute, and that will let our presenters maximize their audio capacity. I'm actually really excited about today's topic and the opportunities that are available to you with the BC Employer Training Grant. Workforce training is very relevant, and given our current labor market and workforce fluidity. How relevant? I actually thought I'd start off today with the top 10 reasons to train your staff. So my quick Google search led me to 2.6 billion articles on the benefits of training staff. So there's not 10 reasons, there's literally millions. But what there isn't always is the funding. And that's where the Employer Training Grant can come in and be a good resource for you to co-share these expenses. Our guest presenters today join us from the Ministry of Advanced Education and Skills Training, Cameron Ferrie and Andrew Howley. Cameron is the Director of Employer Programs and Services with 10 years experience in program management. He's worked in various economic immigration and labor market programs in British Columbia and this other place called Ontario. During this time, Cameron has worked with employers and employer groups to support provincial economic development priorities. Andrew is an adjudication analyst with the BC Employer Training Grant. And he has served the province over the last decade in several roles, but most recently he has worked to make the Employer Training Grant more accessible to British Columbians. So those of you who maybe have accessed the Employer Training Grant before will know how different it is from now. And as an adjudication analysis, Andrew assesses grant applications for eligibility, and he works with employers to help them achieve their workforce training objectives. Welcome, Cameron and Andrew, and thank you for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks for that introduction. I'd also like to acknowledge that I'm calling in from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So I'm also privileged to be on this land. As Laurie mentioned, I'm here as well as my colleague Andrew, and we're really excited to share. Maybe this is new to some of you folks on the line, or maybe folks have accessed the grant before, and we can talk about some of the improvements, just like Andrew was working on, trying to make it more accessible for employers. So really what we'll do a high-level overview. And because we made some pretty significant improvements over the last few months, our overview is actually relatively short. We're trying to make it as accessible as possible. So that's a good sign that actually the application is much more straightforward now. And we'll kind of talk about what that looks like, what that process might look like. And so here are the 2 areas we'll look at, the overview as well as the application process. And I think it'll be a great opportunity afterwards to hear about some comments, questions that might come up. And Andrew is the technical expert on the call. I'm so happy to have him here. We'll be able to assist, and we'll be able to get you some information that will, of course, hopefully help you access the skills training funding, because absolutely having that funding for workforce development to meet the ever-changing labor market is very important. So thank you again, Lori, for hosting us, and thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. So you're probably wondering what this employer training grant program is, and it's an employer-driven program. So this is really, the employer is the applicant. So you as the business community would be our, one second, sorry, just would actually be getting the application ready and submitting it online. And so what the program is, it actually provides skills training funding to employers to upskill or reskill their workforces. So the funding could be for training existing employees. So perhaps you have employees already that need to be kind of upskilled to advance in their career, or potentially you might have someone who's unemployed but needs a little bit of skills training to get that job. And so really those are the two areas that we'll focus in on is one, the current workforce that you as the employer may have, and also perhaps someone who's unemployed, they're not in the labor market, and you can access the skills training funding to get them that job, to get them those skills. You're probably also wondering why, and I think Lori did a great job in explaining that it's in the interest of employers to invest in their workforce. We know that the ever-changing labor market requires changes to how people work, what they need to learn, how they need to advance in their career. Some examples here, we've got kind of new technology in the workplace, for example, or employers have an employee interested in a new role, but they may lack the necessary skills. So that's really speaking to the kind of that advancement in their career. As I mentioned, if their employers have a vacancy but can't find the work with the right skills, they can access the grant to hire an unemployed person into a job and get this funding for that skills training. Of course, the big question is, what is the funding? How does that actually work? And so really what you'll find as we go through our presentation here is that, and we'll talk about the types of training. It's quite diverse. It's what the business needs, but it's a cost sharing program. And so that's really important because it's a shared cost between us as the ministry as well as the employer themselves. So for the cost of training, we cover 80% of the cost of training, and then that remaining 20% would be on the employer. So $1,000 training course, we could cover $800, and the employer would be, it shows the investment in the workforce as well, would be responsible for $200 in that scenario. So with that 80% maximum, employers can apply throughout the year. So there's no intake period that we have. It's open year round. And employers can apply for up to $10,000. That would be the absolute max per employee that they would have training. So they can apply multiple times as long as it doesn't go past that $10,000 max. There is a company max of $300,000. We rarely see this. So I wouldn't spend too much time on that, but that's just in case it's, maybe a large organizations who have high number of employees. But generally, the $10,000 max would be for employees, and it really depends on the type of training. That could be, as we go through a couple of examples in a minute, some of the training that we see, for example, with mandatory entry-level training for truck driving would max out at $10,000 because it's a very expensive training. Whereas some of the other type of training, for example, first aid certification or whatnot, would be quite a lot cheaper. So there can be multiple opportunities for employers to apply throughout the year. The final point on this is it is for short-term training, so we are looking for under 52 weeks. So this is not for bachelor's degrees, for example. It's really for occupational certificate. So you're probably wondering, well, that's great, Cameron, but what does this mean in real life? And so we were actually able to look to see what was in the area around Parksville, the Nanaimo, and the island. And just in the last few months, over the last year, what kind of training did we support? And this might kind of give you an idea. So I'm just going to read a couple of examples just to kind of hear if it resonates. So we funded an employment services organization in Parksville, approved for over $4,000 for 17 employees to attend Indigenous cultural competency training. And this funding enabled the organization's employees to build stronger relations with local Indigenous communities. So that was really, it might not be the type of training you're initially thinking about, but like I mentioned, this training is diverse. It's what the employer needs. So it could be this type of training. We also did funding for a plumbing and gas company in Nanaimo, approved $1,600 to train one of its employees as an apprentice plumber. So this funding allowed the company to upskill its workforce, advancing the employee's career. So it includes some of that apprenticeship training as well. We have one last example here, a towing company in Nanaimo. We are approved for $10,000 to provide an employee with Class 1 mandatory entry-level training. So that was that expensive training that I was indicating before. And this funding allowed the company to upskill its workforce from a regular driver into Class 1. So it really not only did it advance the employees' work, but also what the business needed at that time. And that's very, that mandatory entry-level training is very expensive. $10,000 is the max for the employer training grant could cover. And so whatever is beyond that would be covered by the employer, but has really helped support that sector quite a bit. So as you can see in those three examples, it's quite diverse. It kind of goes from kind of cultural training, and we support project management, whatever the occupational certification and first aid. We've supported another high priority that we see is early childhood certification. So really this occupational certification for employers to either get employees that are not in the workforce and get them with the right skills training in order to get the jobs, or a lot of times that it's the current workforce, the existing employees, and allows them to advance maybe to, in that example of early childhood educators, what we see sometimes is early childhood assistants, and then they're able to access funding so that they can become early childhood educators through the ECE certification. So those kind of hopefully kind of resonate, if you're kind of on the call and you're thinking, how could this work in my business? There's a lot of opportunity if you kind of think of what kind of training you would actually need. Before I move to the next slide, there's just a couple of things we wanted to identify that, just for barriers that you might see when applying. Thinking back to what Laurie was saying about tips, we don't want to have employers go through this whole process only to be denied. For example, one of the things we see is that there is some participant eligibility. So for example, the employee that you're looking to upskill, reskill, they would need to be a Canadian citizen, permanent resident, or protected person under the Immigration Act. So that's a really important piece that employers, we do see from time to time, it's not for folks on work permits. We know there's a large number of temporary foreign workers here in BC. So this funding, it's federal funding that we receive through the Workforce Development Agreement, and so it's not directed for international students or foreign workers. So that's one kind of thing that comes to mind to really identify the individual and ensure that they're also eligible. Which is a nice segue into this next slide, because really what this is about is the steps. Because at this point you might be thinking, okay, I've got an idea. How do I actually do it? And so really it's a two-step process where the employer first identifies that training and then submits a claim. And I'll go through each of these steps now. But essentially, what we need the employer, the very first step, and most employers should have a business BCE ID, but if not, they would have to create one. And this essentially allows the employer to deal with the government, access government services. And this is needed to actually access our online application. And once that's completed, the employer would then, of course, there is some onus on employers, the business community, to identify what that training need is. So whether it's mandatory training for truck driving, or maybe it's apprenticeship, it is up to the employer to identify what the training is and who the training provider that they want to use. So there is some bit of homework that they need to do in terms of identifying who is being trained as well, like who the participant is, what the training program will look like, and where the training is going to take place and who's putting it on. Well, once they have all that information, the employer will access our website. And if you go to our website now, it's just one application model. So that's a that's a significant improvement that we've made over the last few months, is that really there's one apply button. There used to be at one point, there used to be 5 or more streams that employers would have to navigate through. And we realized through employer feedback, but that was way too confusing. And so really it's streamlined. It's a one application model where the employer would apply, answer the questions related to what I just mentioned, who the training is for, why is it relevant, and a bit of information about the training program and the training provider itself, and then submit the application. Once we review the application, we will, and if it's approved, we'll send an agreement, and also electronically, and the employer will log in and accept the agreement. That agreement essentially outlines what the application had, which would include the type of training, who's being trained, et cetera, and the costs, because of course this is all about funding, so I want to make sure that the costs are accurate. So once that step is done, the employee that's being trained can start can begin. But as soon as the employer pays for that training, and that's an important piece here, is that because it's an employer-driven program, the employer needs to actually pay for that training, and we reimburse the employer, not the employee. So it's important that the employer pays for that training. But as soon as that employer pays for that training, they can submit that claim to us. The training doesn't have to be completed. If it's a 4-week or 8-week long training course, as soon as they pay for that training and they have that receipt, they can submit it to us. So that should get the money back into the hands of the employer more quickly. And really, they should be done within 30 days that they pay for the training. So really wanting to get those reimbursements back to the employer as quick as possible, so they don't actually have to wait for it. It's just whenever they pay for it. Once that's done, the employee, of course, pays for or takes the training, and the result of the training should be either a job if it's someone that was unemployed, or if there's someone that's already in the workforce, it should result in, and there's a number of ways to look at this, but really what we consider a better job. It could be increased pay, it could be more job security, it could be career advancement. There's all sorts of ways that we can define that, but essentially that's what it would look like. And so the employer would essentially be reimbursed what was in the agreement, which was 80% of the training costs. And that essentially is what the process looks like. I will leave it there for now. This is our email address for any questions that might come up later, because you're probably, as you navigate our website, or maybe we don't get to all the questions now, you might have additional questions, and it's monitored throughout every single day by Adjudication.